Hi, my name is Wayne Rady. I'm recording this in Bullet Tree Falls Lodge in Belize in Central America. I met the author Tim Farrell in Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands. Chapter 2, Barracuda. New York was just a stopover for my next assignment, this time in Micronesia, some islands in the Western Pacific. Our assignment was Guam, where my mom was to work for the court and my dad for the University of Guam, where Keanu had established a visiting mathematics chair for kids from the islands. I was sent to the international school. At the time, Guam was the first stop for many Vietnamese refugees and boat people. This operation incidentally was run by our neighbor, Admiral Morrison, father to the Doors from Man, Jim Morrison. During my second day of school, I met Maggie. Her parents, like many Vietnamese, had left the North after the country was divided. Vietnam had a strong Catholic tradition dating back 400 years to Portuguese explorers and later Jesuit missionaries. The Jesuits even invented Vietnam's writing language to better help them spread the word of the God. Indeed, it was the fourth most populous Catholic country in Asia, the Philippines having the most adherents. Maggie's folks, like a million other Catholics, had fled to the South when religion was outlawed. The president of South Vietnam at the time was Catholic, so a lot of foreign aid and government benefits were steered through the church, a policy that alienated most of the population who were Buddhists. Her father eventually joined the South Vietnamese Army, a haven for Catholics, where he was quickly promoted as the war drew to a close. His rank put him in serious danger of being purged by the communists, so he had been resettled by the U.S. Army to Fort Indian Town Gap near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Eventually, he would move to Arlington, Virginia, as did many other Vietnamese. His family managed to escape on their own and were transiting through Guam when we were there. Since her dad had been an officer and was set up with a job by the U.S. Army, he had resources to ensure that Maggie kept going to school, even though they would just be in Guam for a short time. So she and her twin sister joined me at the international school. Maggie's sister seemed pretty normal and met some friends with the other girls and the teacher's nephew, Mike. But for some strange reason, Maggie latched on to me and followed me around silently wherever I went. She was really quiet and a bit of a tomboy, swinging on the monkey bars with me, whereas her sister was soon chattering away in English. Maggie was a little slow in the language department, probably on account of the fact that we just used to play games, or draw, or paint, or whatever, and didn't talk much. But one thing we did do with the rest of the class was watch Sesame Street together. Television on Guam was pretty sketchy in those days, but the teachers at the international school, including mine, Madeline, recognized the significance of the program and made sure that we all watch it every day. In particular, the program was good at teaching the alphabet. Each letter would be described and common words containing the letter would be featured on the show. Big Bird was Maggie's favorite. Big Bird must have been 8 feet tall, yellow. He seemed to be about our age and pointing out all these great wonderful things to us. We really enjoyed the skits and songs that introduced Maggie to letters and numbers. I had those under control thanks to the years with my mom in Cape Town. But I liked the presentation and the Cookie Monster. As the semester progressed, we went through the alphabet with Big Bird's help. When we got to V, among other things, Big Bird said it stood for Vamos, and all the little puppets made little peace signs, said Vamos, and ended the show. Sometimes we would also watch Star Trek. My mom approved because one time she had met fellow Canadian William Shatner on an Air Canada flight. My dad never got a straight answer on why she had sat next to him on a long flight, but it was all in fun. They were fans. I'm not sure that Maggie understood the show, but she seemed to like Spock. Sometimes she would outline the Vulcan peace sign of her hand with crayons. One time, we lost track of time on the playground. She grabbed both my shoulders and turned me to her. When she had my attention, she gave me her best expressionless Vulcan face and gave me the sign. It took me a second before I realized that we were missing the show. I did my best Vulcan face, then started tickling her until she laughed, and we went back inside to watch Star Trek. A few days after the Sesame Street show featuring the letter V, Maggie's mom came to pick up the girls. They had a little meeting with Madeline by her desk, and when they were done, Madeline announced that Maggie and her sister were moving to the mainland and for us to wish them safe travels. As her mom lifted her up to take her away, Maggie twisted around and looked at me, gave me a little V Vulcan peace sign. Vamos, she said, and tears started coming down her face. It was the only word she ever said to me. After Maggie left, I was really sad. Indeed, I came to realize that Maggie was my first love. Without my new body, I was not enjoying school at all. So my parents sent me to a therapist who suggested that I might be bored in school because it was either too challenging or not challenging enough. But the only way to tell was to do an IQ test to be sure. My mom, the transcriptionist, has access to all kinds of child development and educational tools through the family law court. And of course, my dad could get anything through the university. So one day they brought me a stack of books and told me to prepare for the exam. Sesame Street to me had always been too easy, but it had been fun. After unilateral declaration, I had learned to read and had not been afraid to use a dictionary. So every waking hour, I just powered over the books and took as many practice tests as I could. Then, about a month later, my mom brought me back to the therapist who administered the test. I scored well for an elementary school student in the 140s, even just going through the material once. I had retained enough information to score in the same range as any of the kids at the university. That summer, one of my dad's students, Moe Brick took me under his wing. My dad thought I need a break from traditional schooling. My mom was a little bit nervous. Moe, after all, was from a tiny island in Yap and had worked for years as a seaman. He was a tough guy, tougher than the uniform crew of the Queen Elizabeth, but he had been educated by Peace Corps volunteers and was very well spoken. So eventually my mom came around. Plus, Moe needed some money, having taken a break from working aboard a trust territory inter-island supply ship. So they hired him to watch over me. Moe was hoping that he could move up from being a deckhand, but he needed to learn math so that he could pass the navigation part of the certification exam. I was hesitant at first, preferring to hang out at the library and read, but Moe was persistent and made my days fun. He would pick me up every day at sunrise, and we would walk down to the beach from our apartment in Marizo, not far from the university. Some days he would just sit with me in a tide pool and tell me to feel the ocean and how it moved. Mostly I would be distracted by the critters in the water, but Moe had names and stories for all the critters. There was a Barnacle Boy and Bat Ray Man, our superheroes. Then there was a sponge and a starfish. There was a little puffer fish that used to visit us, as well as a crab and a little octopus. Over time, things started to sink in. Some days he would take me out in his canoe when we needed to get somewhere. I will never forget, he would point his canoe at where we were going and tell me that it was coming to us. We were not going anywhere. He taught me how to fish, watch the birds, and read the wind and the waves until it became second nature. During the evening, much like my days in Akimota village, he would take me to the man's house the outer islands had built, and I would listen to stories about the man's open ocean feats of navigation and sailing. After a few drinks, the man would break into songs. Many of the songs were about the creatures Moe had introduced to me in the lagoon. There was the little plankton, for example, who lived in a beer can under the sea. He would tell them that if they wanted to drink beer and tuba or fermented coconut beverage, they needed to flop on the deck like a fish. There were funny little tunes that I used to tap away at a drum to help them keep the beat. The sad thing was that I was the only kid at the man's house, howler, local, or outer islander. I could tell that Moe noticed this and that he feared that traditional navigation would die in his own culture. But island kids were like I had been, busy learning new things. The older kids were more interested in building hot rocks than carving out canoes. Moe himself had gone to the university to learn more about math to help him with his own navigational skills and get certified to run big ships. I was the exception, but only because I had lived in Achimota village and had the privilege of the chief's attention. The man's house was a familiar territory to me. I think Moe realized that it would take a lot of work and individual attention if he was able to get the island kids interested. Towards the end of summer, my dad got the offer to work at his alma mater. My dad got the offer to work at his alma mater, so we packed it up and headed to Houghton, Michigan, in the state's Upper Peninsula. Needless to say, it was a big change from the tropical islands of the Western Pacific. I've missed Moe and the attention he had given me. Moe was an amazing guy. He would go on to have 16 kids and teach hundreds of young islanders about the ancient art of navigation, reviving the Maori traditions in New Zealand and the ancient navigational skills and traditions of Tahiti and Hawaii. He would travel tens of thousands of miles in an open canoes without the benefits of modern technology or the certifications required to operate the big trans-territory inter-island ships, using only the traditional methods handed down to him by the elders. I've also missed Maggie, who of course was gone, but Moe had told me that I was now pointed to her and that she would come to me someday. One of the first things my folks did upon returning to the mainland was to go to the drive-in, something they had not done in years of international travel. Easy Rider, starring Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson, was an R-rated movie, and I'm sure my folks brought me thinking that I would fall asleep, but I totally got it. I was wonderful. The next day, I told them that I wanted to go to Notre Dame and become a lawyer like Nicholson's character in the movie. I guess they were happy that I didn't want to get a chopper and smuggle drugs, so they laughed. But my dad knew that George Gipp, the Gipper, was from Lorient, only about 15 miles from Houghton. So he took me out there to see the house where the Gipper grew up and learn a little more about Notre Dame. He said that if I wanted to go there, then to remember that Moe had taught me, if I kept my eye on the horizon, it would come. Unfortunately, the little town in the Upper Peninsula didn't really have an advanced placement program for second graders, so my mom suggested that I get involved with Bonfire Scouts. Well, that didn't turn out so well. The first week they had just doing simple arts and crafts, which were really not very challenging for me at all. Having been carving paddles and canoes the summer before, since they had substance that one could actually use and were not just tacked to the refrigerator door or whatever. The finger painting and making little things from leather just wasn't for me. It had been great a couple of years earlier with Maggie, but as a very mature 7-year-old, it was moronic. Then, when we went on an overnight field trip, the counselor or scout leader or wherever made us all take our clothes off around the fire and put our legs up, claiming that the light from the fire was good for our perenniums. I was a little bit shy about this whole thing. So as soon as that was over, I went to my tent. Some of the older boys stayed up late with the counselor that night and told me that the counselor had made them drink some Irish whiskey and play with their penises by the fire and say they had to pee into it or something. When I told my mom that I really didn't think the Scots were for me, she laughed and said that what I had heard from the other kids made no sense. But she never pushed me, and besides, I was learning to skate and was really enjoying playing hockey. So that was the end of the Scots for me. But the beginning of winter sports and ice hockey. I learned to skate, and my folks used to take me to the old ice arena to watch the Michigan Tech Huskies. At the time, they were being coached by the legendary John McInnes. So I got an education on hockey close up. I was so fortunate to meet a freshman from Toronto named Steve Coates. Coates didn't play much his freshman year, but he would hang around after practice at the public skates and taught me and some other kids to skate. He was really generous with his time and super funny. Sometimes he would share peanut butter and honey sandwiches with us, a Toronto favorite. I once told him he would be a comedian. He laughed. A few years later, I would learn that he was drafted by the Philadelphia Flyers, so that became my favorite NHL team. And of course, I always wore his number 19 on all the teams I play on. One day, out of the blue, my dad told me we were going back to Africa. A friend of his needed his help in the final training of a guy who called himself Muhammad Ali. My dad was the perfect candidate for the job. The big fight was set for that fall, and the fighters were going to train that summer in Zaire to get used to the climate. My dad was the only person with the credentials who had worked in Africa, and since training would start that summer, the university did not have any classes for him to teach. Plus, Ali was the decided underdog and was looking for a training age. My dad was pretty excited as well. The job was going to pay well and would allow us to buy a second car so that my mom could drive herself to work. Two-car families were a rarity in that age, and Volkswagen had entered the market with an affordable car perfect for the purpose. After we got settled in Kinshasa, my dad and I would go down to the gym every day and watch Ali train. There were a few Americans that hung around the gym, including a guy from New York City who called himself Dapper Dan. Dapper Dan was a sweetheart, and he kind of kept an eye on me when my dad was busy with Ali. He would hold my feet when I did sit-ups and told me some elaborate handshakes to keep me busy and out of trouble. My dad helped Ali with his diet and stretching and strength training, all developing areas in training elite athletes. As the summer ended and our trip grew to a close, I asked my dad if it would be possible for me to go for a run with Ali. My dad, who apparently was not exactly familiar with or caring much about child abuse issues, said sure, although he made it a point to put a big helmet on me and show me how to cover up. Also, by this time, I had gotten to know Ali, who was a great guy and would never hurt me. I got in the ring and danced around Ali. At one point, he put his hand on my head and let me swing wildly into the air. Everyone was having a good time. I said, "Come on, Ali. Let me see what it would be like if you punch me." He got down on his knee and told me to put them up. Just as I was getting set, he took 3 quick jabs, stopping just short of my nose. He was so quick that it happened in the blink of an eye. Before I could even put up my fist, he stopped his punches so close to my face that I could feel the wind his big gloves had created. I stood there for a second in awe, then started dancing around Ali, who was still on his knees, getting a few jabs in and trying to taunt him a little. "I'm the greatest," I say, and he would laugh. "Come on," I say. I wanted to feel what it would be like to be punched by a heavyweight. Ali looked at my dad, who nodded and indicated that a couple of punches to my midsection would be okay. After all, I had been working and for a 50-pound kid, I have freakishly developed abs. Ali got up and gave me a half-hearted punch to my stomach that sent me flying across the ring into the ropes. My dad was all indicating to me to keep my fists up, so I obliged him and stood there doing my best Ali impression to taunt him a little. Ali punched me again into the ropes. This time it wasn't so bad. The ropes seemed to absorb the punch for me, and I said, "Is that all you got?" "Okay, probably a mistake." Ali punched harder, and I literally flew off my feet into the ropes. Fortunately, I had been ready for it, and Ali and I kind of laughed while he took a couple of more jabs at me, until my dad finally said that was enough. When we were done, I thanked Ali and wished him well. Ali told me that the best way to avoid a punch was to learn how to fake out an opponent, and that he expected me to do that by the next time we met. I promised. As we were leaving, a man that my dad would later tell me that was also sponsoring the fight, Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator, snapped out a cigarette and loudly proclaimed that no wonder Ali was not expected to win if he was training against a 50-pounder. Of course, Ali and his trainer were smarter than that and would work on what would be known as a dope fighting technique, where the boxer lets the ropes absorb the punches and tires out the opponent. Anyway, Ali was my friend, so I ignored Gaddafi and didn't give him any more thought. I was happy to see that Ali won the fight, but I will never forget the pictures of him on Time magazine's cover after his rumble in the jungle. His face and head had taken a pounding. It must have been brutal. Meanwhile, I started educating myself on the classics. My third-grade teacher thought it was funny that I was reading Moby Dick, War and Peace, and all the Dickinson's books. She was not sure if I was really reading them, but not having read them herself, She really had nothing to say or add. I just kept plowing through everything I could get my hands on. Living in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, with all the snow, I learned to ski. I also learned to throw a frisbee at an early age. My neighbor John Davis being involved with Guts Frisbee, a new sport where teams line up against each other and threw the frisbee as hard as they could at each other, scoring points if the other side dropped it. Kind of like dodgeball. He was also an avid road rally racer. I never got a chance to ride with him, but it looked fun. We weren't in Houghton for long. My dad was offered a job at the University of Michigan. Ann Arbor was quite a bit different from Houghton. It was the birthplace of the hippies and the seed from which the summer of love sprouted. The town prided itself as the pop capital of the world. It hosted the Hash Bash every April 1st. Marijuana possession was treated like a parking ticket fine instead of a felony. The kids spelled cool things with a K. The unofficial slogan for the class of '81 was that they smoked dope by the ton. The university's reputation was equal to that of the Ivy League and California schools, and it attracted some of the nation's brightest. Its professors and facilities were equal to the world's best. When we moved to Ann Arbor, they put me in a special school for the gifted. It was a trip. It was like all the college professors' kids at the university had all been gathered together and put it in one place. I was probably the dumbest of the lot. One guy would go on to create a program that would allow computers to search directory servers, allowing search engines as we know them to work on the internet. Summer camp with these people was at Interlochen, a private high school with an association with the university. One of the girls, a couple of years ahead of me, would go on to play Rachel in Blade Runner, the classic science fiction film based on Philip Dick's novel. Rachel was the replicant that would run off with Harrison Ford's character at the end of the film. Another one of the older kids would go on to form a gaming company that would distribute video games such as Mortal Kombat and other iconic video games. The kids were so funny. They would get so focused on whatever project that they were on that they would sometimes drool and fail to wipe their noses. It was disgusting, but we learned a lot from the books that they gave us. Although the most important thing that stuck with me was probably learning how not to drool and to wipe my nose, so at least I looked halfway normal. Anyway, we all read Lord of the Rings together, then move on to Dune. Once in a while, the teacher would sit us down to watch reruns of Star Trek, especially when the show had some hard science to it. Spock was my man, really cool, nerdy stuff, and a nice break from the classics and Piaget's differential equations. My next door neighbor introduced me to skateboarding. For spring break in 5th grade, my mom brought me to New York City to visit my aunt. Like the time in Portugal, it seemed to me that the carpet of a sidewalk in the city must have been made for skateboarding and that it would be perfectly safe to skateboard the length of Manhattan, especially since the elevation at the north end of the island seemed to be slightly higher than the south end. My aunt's co-op was on East 58th, so I had to figure out the subway system to get on the Broadway local up to 215th, which appeared to be the last stop before the river. The plan was to skate all the way down to South Ferry, with a stop at 1133 Park Avenue. The co-op J.D. Salinger had grown up in. As I got down to around 129th Street, I ran into Dapper Dan, the man I had met a couple years earlier in Kinshasa. Dan recognized me immediately. He was selling suits out of the back of his car and greeted me with a very hip handshake that he had taught me. He told a couple of guys that I was the one he had told them about who had got in the ring with Ali. Well, let me tell you, they were impressed. Pretty soon we had a little mob around us with everyone wanting to meet me. Dapper Dan turned up his stereo and invited me to listen to some killer funk and got me some shaved ice to eat. I felt like I was in a movie with Chef. It was all very real, yet foreign to me. The skate down through Harlem had been like something I had never experienced. Dystopian. The city had shrunk by almost 500,000 people after the race riots a few years earlier, and there were still burned out buildings and entire blocks were abandoned and littered with cars stripped and out on blocks. For a white guy from the Midwest, it was out of this world. Even though I had experience in Africa and had black and brown friends around the world, I knew that the African American experience was something that would be difficult for me to emphasize with. As much as I wanted to, and as welcoming as Dapper Dan was to me. After a while, I told Dan that I had to keep moving. He told me to be careful, and eventually I made it back to my arms. A few years later, Dapper Dan will open his own shop using the experience and contacts in Africa to clothe some of greatest hip-hop artists. Unfortunately, there would be some copyright issues with his work, and one day his shop was shut down by some law enforcement, supervised by the future Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, when she was an assistant district attorney. Ms. Sotomayor liked his work, and to this day, despite the fact that I am now a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Dapper Dan is the only person I know who is acquainted with the respected by a sitting member of the Supreme Court. My aunt thought it was neat that I had found her friends co-op on Park Avenue and never asked me about the rest of my skate. I went back to regular school in junior high, Tampan Junior High. To be precise, a homeroom teacher liked me and after learning that I had already gone through the teacher's edition of the textbook within a few weeks of class, started letting me teach, mostly going over the homework problems on the overhead projector. I also learned how to use the film strip projector, and sometimes she would just give me a lesson kit and leave me alone with the class. Being lazy at heart, I taught Billy, the class bad boy, how to use the projector. Billy's mom drove a 1973 lime green Barracuda with a 4-speed 360cc V8. This thing was badass. Billy couldn't wait until he turned 16. His mom had convinced Judge Thomason that she was entitled to it under a property split that was a final knife to her supposedly low-life philandering husband, who of course never paid child support. As a result, Billy was one of the few kids in the class who was on the school lunch program. Billy was the only boy at Tempe with shorter length hair. He was always getting into trouble. He was one of those kids that the school administrators insisted he go on a patrol with the cops. I guess the idea was that he would learn that crime does not pay, but he would always tell us stories about how the cops had kicked someone's ass or beat the shit out of the pup or had not looked while he grabbed some weed before the evidence was processed, or whatever. For some reason, he liked me, and although he was trouble when the teacher was in front of the class, he was really well behaved with me. My most valuable classes in junior high were home electronics, where I learned how to wire things together, typing, which would be invaluable as the computer age dawned, and introduction to music, which taught me to read music and would allow me to better understand what musicians were doing around me throughout my life as I tapped away a bit for them. Out of class, student government would prove useful. I also got into superheroes. My favorite, besides the one Moe had made up for me, was a Black Panther. Because I had lived in Africa, never was fond of Captain Canuck. I also did a lot of skateboarding at this time, and I subscribed to Skateboarder magazine and dreamed of someday riding on the boardwalk in Venice Beach. Before we was a crush of humanity brought together by an uncaring, selfish generation to listen to some irrelevant old songs about better times when there actually was a spirit and love in the world, not just greed. Steve saw what I had done and climbed up onto the shoulders of the people around him. I hung upside down with my knees bent around the bar and reached down for him, and he climbed and kicked his way up into the awning. After about an hour, the doors were opened and broke or whatever, and the crowd surged through. It was like a herd of cattle. Steve, never one to avoid a chance to light out a joint, did so and handed it to me as we hung out in the awning, letting the crowd clear. When it was done and the crowd was gone, there were dozens of people lying on the ground. We would later learn that about 10 of them would never get up. It was awful. I hate Cincinnati and the Who. That spring, I was introduced to reggae music. My old teacher, Robert Mugabe, had officially taken over Rhodesia and was now the new country's first black president. There was a huge week-long party featuring a musician I had never heard of named Bob Marley. As I listened to the celebration, the beat of the music really got to me, and I started playing along. I had to have more. Toronto, as it happens, has a huge Jamaican diaspora, and soon I was sneaking into the reggae bars. It was great, and of course, they smoked the best weed. The summer, I got a job down at Q Beach, Toronto's answer to Venice Beach, and taught windsurfing, a new sport that was becoming very popular. It was a nice way to finish my year. I spent most of my time at a huge mansion owned by the guy that owned the shop near the beach, so I didn't spend too much time with Sonny's family. I did, however, have 2 girlfriends from the University of Toronto who live at the house. Girlfriends definitely came in pairs for me in Toronto. When I first moved there, I met 2 girls at night school. St. Mike's did not have a band or any music classes, so I had signed up for a program with the public school system. The girls were from Spain. One played the flute and one played the clarinet. They liked to share. Then at a Christmas party, I met 2 girls from Bishop, an all-girls school. One girl wanted to save her virginity for her husband and was super Catholic, but she loved having sex with her friend. It was kind of strange, but they tell me that it is a very man's dream to have a managed toys. I just kind of took it for granted that this was the way sexual relationships worked in Canada as the 80s decade began.